I'm Sharon Kinoshita, Professor of Literature and Interim Faculty Director of the Humanities Institute. I'd like to welcome you to the third annual Hayden V. White Distinguished Lecture. We are pleased to have all of you with us, either here in person at UCSC's University Center or virtually from around the world. Our speaker tonight, as you all know, is the acclaimed writer, journalist, and translator Juan Gabriel Vásquez, whom I will have the honor of introducing in a moment. This lecture series celebrates the intellectual legacy of the world-renowned scholar Hayden V. White. An animating force in history of consciousness, long the flagship graduate program in the Humanities Division here at Santa Cruz, Hayden's importance and influence extended far beyond this campus. Within the University of California system, he served as university professor, a signal honor conferred by the regents on scholars of international distinction who are also recognized and respected as teachers of exceptional ability. Hayden's strong advocacy on behalf of the humanities, his bold institutional creativity, and his commitment to interdisciplinary work, the same qualities that made HISCON a program that combined radical openness with intellectual rigor, to quote his longtime colleague Jim Clifford, were central to the development of the School of Criticism and Theory, originally housed at UC Irvine and now at Cornell, the Western Humanities Alliance, the UC Humanities Institute, Initiative, now the Humanities Network, and the University of California Humanities Research Institute, UCHRI. And his impact continues. Since we convened here for last year's Hayden V. White Lecture, a selection of his work, foregrounding his work as a public intellectual, has appeared from Cornell University Press under the title The Ethics of Narrative, Essays in History, Literature, and Theory, 1998 through 2007. When Hayden passed away in 2018, remembrances paid tribute, of course, to his vast intellectual accomplishments and influence, but in equal measure recalled his open-mindedness, his capaciousness of spirit, his wit, and generosity. Thus, working in conjunction with Hayden's family, friends, colleagues, students, and admirers, the Humanities Division and the Humanities Institute are proud to be the home of two initiatives that honor and promote this intellectual legacy. The first is the Hayden B. White Endowment in Historical and Cultural Theory. Established by gifts from an international group of donors, family, friends, colleagues, students, and others touched by Hayden's work, this fund provides support for student scholarship, conferences, and seminars. This year, for the second year, it will fund a summer dissertation research fellowship related to historical and cultural theory to be awarded later this spring, open to graduate students in all relevant disciplines all across our campus. The other initiative, which brings us here this evening, is the Hayden V. White Distinguished Lecture Series, established in 2021 with a generous gift from the Thomas H. and Josephine Baird Memorial Fund. This fund has long supported cultural enrichment in and around Springfield, Missouri, bringing a St. Louis-based artist to a local high school, for example, to collaborate with students on a mural bringing the school's mission of elevating and celebrating all learners and their success to life, or sponsoring a whimsical and thought-provoking bronze figure on the Sculpture Walk, Springfield's outdoor museum without walls. We at the Humanities Institute owe the fund's underwriting of the Hayden V. White Distinguished Lecture to Andrew Baird, the last graduate student admitted to History of Consciousness to work with Hayden. Andrew had experienced Hayden's generosity firsthand when, as an undergraduate history major at another institution, his interest in the self-understanding of the historical profession led him to meet and interview Hayden for his senior thesis. Then, coming to UC Santa Cruz, Andrew completed his doctorate in 2003 with a dissertation on how openness to the other might be the condition of possibility for the distinction between history and ideology. It's a great pleasure to welcome Andrew in person this evening to say a few words about Hayden.
Thank you. That's a lot of introduction for me. I wanted to say very briefly, since the lecture is in honor of Hayden, I wanted to make a couple of points that would explain why Hayden, if he were here, would be looking forward to the following lecture as much as I am. Hayden's distinction or notoriety rested largely on his many discussions of the relationship between history and literature. This was what I knew him for when I came here, but to my surprise, when I arrived, he was not really interested at all in talking about historians or professional historical writing at all. He was interested in what he came to call, towards the end of his career, the practical past, which, following Michael Oakeshott, he distinguished the historical past, which is what professional historians study, from the practical past, which is essentially everything else: literature, films, all other cultural treatments of the past that people might use to get through their everyday lives or the predicaments they find themselves in the world. And on the basis of this distinction, he had a number of points. What Hayden felt, I believe, is that literature was far more promising an avenue or a tool for helping people who are troubled by the past. This was maybe before discussions of victimhood or whatever. I mean, that wasn't what we talked about then, but it's people for whom the past is a problem, people who have, present pasts that require working through. He had a number of reasons why literature was a better resource for those people than professional historical writing. I believe that the novels of Juan Gabriel Vásquez exemplify what Hayden was talking about in those essays as well as anyone's does, probably better. And in fact, I recommended at a certain point that Hayden read one of his works called The Sound of Things Falling, because in some formal capacities, I guess, it was reminiscent of a book that Hayden greatly admired, Austerlitz by Sebald, which is a major part of the essay on the practical past. In both The Sound of Things Falling and Austerlitz, you have something like a failed quest narrative in which someone who's afflicted by the past goes looking for more and more information about the past in an effort to heal that affliction or make it go away, cure it. And despite a kind of subtle magical realism that occurs both in Vasquez's work and Sebald's, where you find someone that can tell them all about the things that they want to know and think will help them, they end up, in the end, not being helped much at all, and really in the same predicament that they found themselves in the first place. And this was a point that Hayden would make frequently about the historical past, which is that one more fact probably isn't going to help anyone feel better about what happened. Another point that Hayden would make is that, so he had passed on before the shape of the ruins appeared, but people are on to the idea now that the historical past can be manipulated. I mean, there are historical actors, but they also make efforts to, get rid of the witnesses, hide the documents, seal the files, cover their tracks, muddy the waters. And a point that Hayden would make repeatedly was that, it's okay if you're a professional historian to say that the waters are muddy, things are unclear, we can't know everything, and content yourself with that. But if you are afflicted by the past, the idea that you can never know anything and we can't get to the bottom of it, that's not a satisfactory answer, nor is the idea that if you're pursuing those answers, the more you pursue them, generally speaking, the more you get to be considered dealing in conspiracies or unreasonable, certainly unprofessional. Professional historians are kind of allergic to gnosis. They don't believe that there's a truth that can be found underneath these things. The Shape of the Ruins is a magnificent book, and I'm not going to stand up here and summarize it. But I encourage everyone to read it, and I look forward very much to hearing what our speaker has to say tonight, and I thank you for coming.
Thank you, Andrew. And again, we're deeply grateful to Andrew and his family for their support in making this event possible. Now, before I introduce our featured speaker, a few details about the event. There will be ample time after the lecture for questions from the audience. For our online attendees, we ask you to submit your questions using the Zoom webinar Q&A tool. And finally, this event is being recorded. We are privileged to have with us this evening the internationally acclaimed writer, journalist, and translator Juan Gabriel Vásquez. After studying law in his native Colombia, Vásquez spent 16 years in Europe, in France, Belgium, and Spain, studying Latin American literature, devoting himself to fiction, interspersed with activities as a prize-winning journalist, as a translator of figures such as Victor Hugo and John dos Passos, and as a biographer of Joseph Conrad. Moving back to Colombia in 2012, I was going to say he splits his time between Bogotá and New York City, but I learned in our conversation that that is actually not correct. His numerous novels include The Shape of the Ruins, La Forma de las Ruinas, which was shortlisted for the 2019 International Man Booker Prize, Reputations, Las Reputaciones, a New York Times Best Book of the Year, and The Sound of Things Falling, El Ruido de las Cosas al Caer, a national bestseller and winner of the 2014 International Dublin Literary Award, as well as other prizes from Italy and France. Vásquez's novels have been published in 25 languages worldwide. If Hayden White is best remembered for his insistence on the way historical understanding passes through narrative, Juan Gabriel Vásquez has been an impassioned advocate for the importance of literature, in particular, in teaching us about history. Talking back against the commonplace that literature serves no purpose, he is here to convince us of the ways in which fiction is precisely that which can restore our broken links to the past. Hence his talk today, Restoring Continuity, Notes on History and Fiction.
Okay. Because it's doing weird things? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Andrew, for your words of introduction just now. Margaret, it's a pleasure to meet you. And I want you all to know that it's an honor to be here giving these lectures. Thank you all for coming. So this is the lecture, Restoring Continuity. Notes on history and fiction. I should add one word, seven notes on history and fiction. I'm telling you this so that you can feel the excitement when it's about to be over. On January 16th, 1935, as Europe moved slowly towards war, Paul Valéry gave a lecture at the Université des Annales in Paris, which doesn't seem to suspect that war is a possibility, but whose every line is deeply concerned by the brutal transformations taking place in the world. The title of the lecture was Le bilan de l'intelligence, which can be translated as the assessment of intelligence, or perhaps assessing intelligence, with that gerund that we all love when we have to come up with titles. And his assessment is far from positive. For the last 30 years, he says, disorder has dominated every area of life: journalism, science, politics. Russia, Germany, Italy, the United States are like vast laboratories where research of a hitherto unknown magnitude is being carried out, he says, where attempts are being made to shape a new man, to create a new economy, morals, life, and even religions. Furthermore, the technological revolutions that have taken place since the discovery of electrical current have presented us with unforeseen challenges. He says, we have witnessed the dynamo, X-rays, the work of Pierre and Marie Curie, radio and television, and it's all fascinating, but also unsettling. For many, the world has simply become unrecognizable. I do not want to enumerate to you all that has been deeply modified, altered, replaced since about 30 years, says Valéry. But I will say to you that one could still, 30 years ago, examine the things of this world under a historical aspect. That is to say, that it was then in the spirits of all to seek, in their present moment, the continuation and the rather intelligible development of the events which had occurred in the past. And he concludes, not without a certain melancholy, continuity reigned in the minds. What he means is that human beings have traditionally used the recorded past, recorded in history, in documents, in precedents, to make decisions about the problems presented to them. But now, because of unpredictable transformations in every aspect of human action, these problems are new and unexpected to a degree that nobody has ever seen before. And he says, man finds himself assailed by a quantity of questions which no one until now had thought of. Impotence, incoherence, an anxiety to which we can't get used to, but whose end is impossible to anticipate. These are the consequences of our inability to find in the well of the past the answers to the current disorder. Of course, we may be forgiven if we find in these concerns echoes or prefigurations of our present moment, of our own disagreements with technological revolutions that have upended our private lives, our social conversations, our political traditions, and even the stability of our democracies. But I will put that aside for the moment and concentrate on that continuity, that broken continuity that seems to be central to the tensions or disagreements that Valéry is trying to think about. Continuity is communication with the past. When communication deteriorates or breaks, important things are lost. Knowledge of a certain kind is lost. A possibility of understanding is lost. But what exactly is it that we lose, and how to restore it? Can I have some water, please? So one of my frivolous pastimes is collecting instances in which writers or philosophers, while discussing something entirely different, seem to be talking about fiction. There's, for instance, Hannah Arendt discussing that quality of political thought that she called representative. We form political opinions, she says, after consideration of different points of view. Those of people who are not here, people whom we represent. She writes, the more people's standpoints I have present in my mind while I am pondering a given issue, and the better I can imagine how I would feel and think if I were in their place, the stronger will be my capacity for representative thinking, and the more valid my final conclusions, my opinion. That essay is called Truth and Politics, and it was written in 1964 in response to the controversy created by the publication of Eichmann in Jerusalem. Thank you. But to me, this passage is an unbeatable interpretation of what goes on when we all read Dostoevsky or when we read all of Shakespeare, for instance. Well, something like this happens in another of the lectures Paul Valéry gave in the 1930s. This one took place 3 years before Le Bilan de l'Intelligence. Valéry was facing a different audience, a younger audience, composed mostly of high school students. He was discussing history in general and our relationship with facts, with historical facts in particular. All facts, he said, are subject to different interpretations. The same historical event can lead to different accounts, depending on whether the historian is Michelet, an anti-clerical freethinker, or Joseph de Maistre, an ultra-religious conservative with an authoritarian streak. The reason, says Valéry, the reason for this is that past is an entirely mental thing. It is nothing but images and beliefs. Notice that we use a kind of contradictory procedure, he says, for evoking the various figures of the different epochs. On the one hand, we need the free use of our ability to pretend, to live other lives than our own. On the other, we must restrain that freedom in order to take account of documents, and we make an effort to arrange and organize past events by using our own energy and our own forms of thought and attention, things essentially of the present. The ability from our time and our place in the world to live different lives, lives whose coordinates are different, is, of course, one of the many demands fiction places on us. I'm suddenly remembering a 1955 interview in which Faulkner said that the three things every novelist needed were experience, observation, and imagination. I would add memory to the list. Faulkner would probably say that memory is nothing but recalled experience. To his great irritation, I would then quote Valéry again, and he would go, what, another French? I thought it ended all with Flaubert. But Valéry, who told his students, whenever history seizes you, whenever you think historically, whenever you let yourself be seduced into reliving the human adventure of some bygone era, the interest you take in it is all sustained by the feeling that things could have been quite different, turned out quite different. At each moment, you suppose another moment that followed. At each imaginary present where you place yourself, you conceive another future than the one that was realized. What if Robespierre had won? If Grouchy had arrived in time on the field of Waterloo? If Napoleon had had the navy of Louis XVI? If, Valéry says, always if. At the end of the day, says Valéry, all the abstractions you find in books are empty if you are not given the means of discovering them in your own experience. What was it like to live in such and such a period? This is the essential question we pose ourselves. This, of course, is what moves fiction of that kind that we call historical. It is shaped by the frustration of not knowing firsthand, by the impossibility of visiting that territory we call the past. In 2019, during a visit to the city of Trondheim, the archaeologist Erik Jondel took me on a private tour of the recently discovered ruins of St. Clemens, a medieval church. This is Norway, by the way, a medieval church dating back to the year 1008. Towards the end of the visit, the conversation turned to Leif Erikson, son of Red Erik, who in 1001 had sailed further west from Greenland, where his father had been banished, and reached the Labrador Peninsula, calling it Vinland because of the grapes he found. In Trondheim, walking around St. Clement's Church with Vikings on my mind, I thought that 491 years would pass before Columbus stumbled upon a Caribbean island, and yet we credit him, what we call history credits him, with the discovery of America. His letters were published and trumpeted by the Spanish crown, that powerful storyteller. An overwhelming political machinery bent on taking possession of the new territories, not only physically, but narratively too. The Mexican historian Edmundo O'Gorman says somewhere that America wasn't discovered so much as invented. It was invented in the Chronicles of the Indies, where sirens have the face of a man and beaches are covered in black pearls. It was invented in Bernal Díaz del Castillo's true history of the conquest of New Hispania, in which he compares the Aztec capital to the marvels one reads about in Amadís de Gaula, one of the chivalric romances, incidentally, that made poor Don Quixote lose his mind. Those stories of mythological creatures and utopian lands, remote ancestors of magical realism, would become a rough first draft of Latin American history. They told of improbable worlds, but that didn't matter. Narrative authority was on their side. In chapter 32 of Don Quixote, by Miguel de Cervantes, the priest and the innkeeper are having this passionate discussion about books. The priest says that books of chivalry had made Don Quixote lose his mind, and the innkeeper he just doesn't see how that can happen, since those books have given him nothing but joy. He brings a traveling suitcase with 3 large books in it. 2 of them are chivalric romances, and the other one is a historical chronicle about the exploits of a famous captain. The priest wants to burn the romances. He says, these 2 books are false and full of foolishness and nonsense, whereas the other one chronicles the real life of a real hero. A man so strong, he says, that with 1 finger he could stop a mill wheel when it turned. The innkeeper is unimpressed. Look at what amazes you, stopping a mill wheel, he says. By God, now your grace ought to read what Felix Marte of Hyrcania did, when with 1 reverse stroke he split 5 giants down to the waist like dolls' children made out of beans. There's a typo there. The priest explains patiently that there never was a Felix Marte of Hyrcania in this world or any other such knight. Chivalric novels, he explains, are just fictions made up by idle minds. And the innkeeper is indignant. Your grace shouldn't try to treat me like a child, he screams, because by God, I am not an idiot. That's really something, he says. Your grace wants me to think that everything these good books say is foolishness and lies, when they've been printed with the permission of the gentlemen of the Royal Council, as if they were the kind of people who'd allow the printing of so many lies. One of the great enactments of these preoccupations takes place in Terra Nostra, Carlos Fuentes', Mexican novelist Carlos Fuentes' massive, hallucinatory exploration of what the novel calls the least accomplished, the most aborted, the most latent and longing of all histories, the history of Spain and Hispanic America. In the novel, we are introduced to Valerio Camilo's theater of memory. It is a medieval invention in which the only spectator occupies the stage while the performance takes place in the auditorium. And there, produced by an incomprehensible system of ropes and pulleys, projected on multiple canvases by a mysterious light, the spectator would witness not only what has been, but also what might have been and never was. Calpurnia talks Caesar out of attending the Senates on the Ides of March. In a stable in Bethlehem, a baby girl is born, becomes a prophetess, is pardoned by Pontius Pilate, and watches Barabbas die on the cross. Odysseus dies, consumed by flames, inside his wooden horse. Columbus travels east by land in search of the kingdom of Genghis Khan. What will the kings of this world pay me for this invention, says Valerio Camilo, this invention that will permit them to recall what could have been but was not? Nothing, Maestro Valerio, replies Monsignor Ludovico, his interlocutor, for the only thing that interests them is what really is and what will be. You do not understand me, Monsignor. The images of my theater bring together all the possibilities of the past, but they also represent all the opportunities of the future. For knowing what was not, we shall know what demands to be. What has not been, you have seen, is a latent event awaiting its moment to be. Its second chance, the opportunity to live another life. History repeats itself only because we are unaware of the alternate possibility for each historic event. The novel as a genre, is not only the place where we recover the past and preserve it, it's also the domain of the possible, where the invisible becomes visible. If this is true, the name of this wonderful concoction, the theater of memory, is perhaps not as metaphorical as it seemed. This is what certain novels are, canvases on which we recover all those stories that, if official history had its way, would be forgotten and left to die. In the first pages of By the Sea, Abdul Razak Gurna's novel, the Tanzanian Nobel Prize from a couple of years ago, one of the two narrators meditates on the relationship that his African country has had with its British colonizers. He recalls his childhood education received in the language of the colonizers and recalls the confused impression that education had made on him. It was, he tells us, something akin to admiration for the colonizers who had so confidently come to these lands to do important things that the colonized ignored. Cure diseases, for instance, or fly airplanes. But then he thinks that admiration is not the word. What he felt, what children like him brought up in that system felt, was more like a concession. And what was it that the locals were conceding to the colonizers? Control, the man says. Control over their material lives, but also over their minds. And then come these wonderful lines, which I will quote at length because every word matters. In their books, I read unflattering accounts of my history, and because they were unflattering, they seemed truer than the stories we told ourselves. I read about the diseases that tormented us, about the future that lay before us, about the world we lived in and our place in it. It was as if they had remade us, and in ways that we no longer had any recourse but to accept. So complete and well-fitting was the story they told about us. I don't suppose the story was told cynically, because I think they believed it too. It was how they understood us and how they understood themselves. And there was little in the overwhelming reality we lived with that allowed us to argue, not while the story had novelty and went unchallenged. I think it's a lucid description of the invisible effects of colonialism. The visible ones are, of course, well known to all and often appear in the newspapers, almost always taking the form of violent events or, in any case, of human suffering. But what Gurna's character describes, the slow imposition on a society of a story that is not its own, this political equivalent of brainwashing, is the conquest of something that is ultimately much more valuable than the geographical territory of a country. It's the territory of the mind. Remember Valéry. The past is an entirely mental thing. The ability to impose a particular narrative on society, isn't this what political power is? Always. When society accepts the narrative imposed by another, when it makes it its own and begins to live in it and understand itself through it, the colonizers can say they have triumphed because they have managed to break the continuity that previously existed between a human being and his place in the world. is uncomfortable because it is always rebelling against imposed narratives, introducing dissent, giving a version of our common history that is discordant or unsubmissive, preventing by its mere existence the establishment of a single monolithic history. It may seek, this literature, to restore that broken continuity. And this, of course, is terribly annoying, at least for the authoritarian in office. But it's what fiction does. In the overwhelming reality in which we live, Gurna's words, fiction allows us to contradict the story that something or someone is trying to impose on us, the story that will triumph while it has novelty and goes unchallenged. This obviously goes beyond politics. Theodor Adorno noted somewhere that one of the hallmarks of a fascist is a deep aversion to introspection, or to all things that invite introspection. Because, of course, group identification cannot work if the members of the group are inward-looking. If they refuse to participate in the collective narrative or do not believe it, if they declare themselves agnostics or disinterested or merely skeptical, by the very fact of inviting the citizen to become a private individual and reject gregariousness, imaginative literature becomes nothing short of subversive. Almost 50 years ago, during a public conversation they had in Lima, in Peru, Gabriel García Márquez said to Mario Vargas Llosa, almost offhandedly, that he knew of no genuine literature that seeks to exalt established values. And although the example of Kipling comes to mind, at the same time a genuine writer and a redoubtable colonialist, I can understand what he is saying. And I also believe that this is one of the debts Latin America owes to those novelists sitting there talking, as well as to others, Carpentier in Cuba, Fuentes in Mexico, Cabrera Infante in Cuba, Ricardo Piglia in Argentina, whose novels just blew up the very notion of a single history and left us in their wake a multiple and unfathomable continent of ambiguous past and ungraspable present, whose overwhelming reality we, the novelists, are still trying to explore, to understand, to convey. In March of 1868, Tolstoy published an essay about war and peace, trying to explain the questions his book had aroused from its very genre. It is not a novel, he says, still less an epic poem, still less a historical chronicle, to its approach to historical events, which some readers, historians among them, had strongly criticized because of inaccuracies. He explains that the disparity between his account of events and that of historians is not only not accidental, it is inevitable. A historian and an artist, he says, describing a historical epoch have two completely different objects. He writes, he uses the example of a battle. He says that the artist, using his own experience and documents, arrives to a conclusion that often is the opposite of the historian. Why? Because their sources are different. For the historian, he says, the main source is the report of individual commanders and the commander-in-chief. The artist can draw nothing from such sources. They tell him nothing, explain nothing. Moreover, the artist turns away from them, finding in them a necessary falsehood. The mechanisms that create a version of an event are fallible, vulnerable to our own humanity. Tolstoy knew them well because he had seen them at work. And so he writes, "Make the rounds of a whole army right after a battle, even on the second or third day, before the reports have been written, and ask all the soldiers, the senior and junior officers, how it went. They will tell you what all these men experienced and saw, and you will form a majestic, complex, infinitely diverse, oppressive, and vague impression. And from no one, least of all the commander-in-chief, will you know how it went. But after 2 or 3 days, the reports begin to be submitted, talkers begin telling how what they did not see happened, and finally, a general account is put together, and the general opinion of the army is put together from this account. It is a relief to everyone to exchange his doubts and questions for this false but clear and always flattering picture. As soon as they happen, events begin to recede from us, and their truth starts to become muddled. Misrepresentation is inevitable, at least in the documents we call official, from which so often history is made. And a deep distortion is created in the existing communication between us and our past. The narrator of one of my novels, The Sound of Things Falling, who may or may not have read Tolstoy, says that we are terrible judges of the present moment, maybe because the present doesn't actually exist, he says. All is memory. This sentence that I just wrote is already a memory. This word is a memory that you, reader, have just read. This is also why we are so sadly dependent on narration. In a sense, everything is always in the past. And the past is always withdrawing, always fugitive, but always looking at us like the angel in Walter Benjamin's often quoted metaphor. This is Paul Klee's drawing that Walter Benjamin took as inspiration for his metaphor of the angel of history, looking at us but receding from us. In a sense, to write about the past is to imbue a series of events with a meaning not their own, a meaning they lack, that is, until they assume the shape of a narrative. Writing fiction about the past is striving to listen to soldiers, not just commanders-in-chief. It is opening a space where experience can speak for itself, seemingly without intermediaries, even though we know they're there. It is a space where the majesty and the complexity and the diversity and even oppressiveness of experience are embraced rather than leveled. In other words, fiction is a place where we can know or feel we know what was it like to live in such and such a period, as Valéry said. It, of course, is an illusory attempt, but there is knowledge to be gained in the process, and knowledge of a kind that is unavailable elsewhere. In Against Historical Realism, his brilliant consideration of war and peace, Hayden White recalls that extraordinary coincidence in the early 19th century of two unforeseeable events, the transformation of history into a science and what he calls the development of the romance as a serious literary genre. Ford Madox Ford, by the way, was also of the opinion that something noteworthy had happened around that time. In the 1920s, he pointed out the moment when the novel became, these are his words, his beautiful words, a profoundly serious and many-sided discussion, and therefore a medium of profoundly serious investigation into the human case. The human case, I love that. In other words, when it came into its own, when a novel came into its own, this took place, he says, somewhere between Diderot and Stendhal. I love that sentence over there, but let me get back to Hayden White, who discusses War and Peace in the light of the once stringent division between historical fact and literary fiction. The new science of history, Hayden White writes, was officially committed to the objective study of individual real events and their description in a true as against a fictional narrative. It was to be separated from philosophy and theology and limit itself to the depiction of the way things really were, rather than the way they might have been or the way one might have wished them to have been. A novelist who writes in Spanish, such as me, can't read these words without reaching for the nearest copy of Don Quixote, where the young scholar Sansón Carrasco discusses the difference between poetry and history. The poet can relate or sing of things not as they were, but as they ought to have been. And the historian must write of them not as they ought to have been, but as they were, without adding to the truth or taking away from it anything whatever. The words are ironic, as everything is in Cervantes' book, but they're also suggesting an opposition between the truth of Don Quixote's story and the falsehoods of chivalric romances. But elsewhere in the book, there are many moments in which Cervantes' respect for historical truth comes to the surface. My favorite, probably because it was used by Jorge Luis Borges, the great Argentinian writer, to write one of the great short stories of my tradition. My favorite comes early in the book and in Cervantes' own voice. Cervantes has inserted himself as a character in the story he is writing, and he says, "The duty and obligation of historians is to be exact, truthful, and dispassionate." 1605. And then he says, "Neither interest, nor fear, nor rancor, nor bias should deflect them from the path of truth, whose mother is history, that rival of time, repository of deeds, witness of the past, exemplar and counselor to the present, admonisher to the future." Dispassionate objectivity as the preeminent value of historical writing. Hayden White dedicated some of his best pages, or at least the ones that have been most important for me as a novelist, to questioning this idea, this prejudice. He notes approvingly how, for Tolstoy, there are no beginnings or endings in history, only a stream of happenings that historians break up in different ways and out of which they make stories, quite arbitrarily. The imposition of a narrative form on the haphazard events of human past was an essential part of his understanding of history as a discipline. He realized that because it is narrative in nature and to tell a story is to select, stress, or disregard, history cannot be a mere vessel of information, a neutral assessment of events. It always involves ethical choices. It entails a debate about values. To write about the past is to organize events, to give them shape. The past does not exist by itself, or rather is not visible until it is selectively interpreted in a narrative. This is what he called memorably emplotment. I wish I had been aware of this 2.5 years ago when I was finishing a novel about the real lives of a friend and his family and trying to justify the feeling that even if I had invented nothing, my book was still a work of fiction. In the work of an old Colombian grammarian, Rufino José Cuervo, I found this entry for the verb fingir, which means to pretend, and which corresponds in Spanish to the noun fiction. The dictionary says that fingir is to model, to design, to give shape to something, said of physical objects such as sculpture and similar to carve. This is the definition of to pretend. And maybe this is to model, design, give shape to something. Maybe this is what we do, historians as well as novelists. Out of the gigantic mass of the human past, we carve an image, we model, we design. The stories we tell don't merely discover a past that already exists, but, in an important sense, create it. And I'm not forgetting, fond as I am of etymologies, that the Latin root of invention means to discover. If I'm not mistaken, this idea was controversial in Hayden White's case. To my mind, however, it only underlines what every autocrat or denialist has always known, that the past is up for grabs, and reminds us of the constant struggle we are in. Our sense of continuity with the past is broken by ignorance, by distortion, or deliberate falsehoods, but also by the naive conception of the past as something definitive and immutable. A place that's there for us to visit every time we want, instead of what it really is, a fragile entity, easily manipulated and even destroyed, vulnerable to political, religious, and social forces. When they're at work, what those forces do is distort or undermine our communication with the past, our sense of continuity with it. Literature, I think, doesn't have a mission, but it may serve one purpose among many. By confronting those versions of our common past, it repairs its formal integrity. It restores that broken continuity. In November of 2020, as life traveled reluctantly from the most serious months of the pandemic to a kind of normality, I met the artist Doris Salcedo inside one of her works of art. Inside, because the work of art in question, entitled Fragmentos, or Fragments, is a small building in downtown Bogotá, a museum intended to house other works of art, but whose main characteristic, what makes it unique, is the fact that its floor was built with the materials resulting from the melting down of 8,994 weapons of war, guns and assault rifles that were turned in by the FARC guerrilla as part of the peace agreements in 2016, then molded into solid sheets by the hammer blows of a group of women, all victims of sexual violence during our long war. This is it. Alone, but for two camera people, we took off our masks and had a 2-hour conversation about her work to be streamed during a festival in Spain. I asked Doris about her role, about the role of memory in her work that was literally palpable in the room where we were, in the floor. In other iconic works, Salcedo had evoked the victims of the 1989 siege of the Palace of Justice in Bogotá, or the men and women dead by drowning while trying to cross the Mediterranean from the coast of Africa. This took place in Spain. Was that part of her fear of oblivion? I asked. The idea that to allow a victim to be forgotten is in some way to make her doubly a victim. In her answer, she evoked a novel we both admire. I believe that the memory of the victim is very different from the memory of those around her, Doris Salcedo said. Toni Morrison, in Beloved, uses an idea that I like very much. Her character has no memory but re-memory. She is a woman who inhabits her traumatic memory. And Morrison uses another verb that has no translation in Spanish, to disremember. That is, said Doris. That is what we do, sometimes as spectators of violence of the kind that we have witnessed. We disremember. It is not a forgetting, which can be involuntary, but an intentional act. We make the decision not to remember. There's a short circuit there. I believe that memory has to be constantly reactivated in order to exist. Memory is always an act of remembering. I think we have a responsibility to exercise memory. We must constantly listen and talk to the victims of our war. In trauma studies, it is very clear that an experience of memory that is enunciated in public, that is received in public, is healing. In human history, there are events so brutal, so protracted in time, that they cause a rupture in the continuum of our experience, a caesura that effectively separates us from our past, hindering its adequate exploration. Beloved is one of the most eloquent instances of this broken relationship with a violent past. In an early scene, Denver, the character Denver, walks into Seth, her mother, while she seems to be praying. "I don't pray anymore," says Seth. "I just talk." "What about?" asks Denver, and Seth replies, "I was talking about time. It's so hard for me to believe in it. Some things go, pass on, some things just stay. I used to think it was my rememory. You know, some things you forget, other things you never do, but it's not. Places are still there. If a house burns down, it's gone, but the place, the picture of it, stays, and not just in my rememory, but out there in the world." Denver asks if other people can see your pictures, your own pictures. "Oh yes," says Seth. "Walking down the street, you can sometimes bump into someone else's rememory." And then she speaks. I can almost hear the quietness in her voice, so like the voices of the victims of Colombian violence that I have spoken to. She speaks about the place where it all happened. "Where I was before I came here," she says, "that place is real. It's never going away. Even if the whole farm, every tree and glass blade of it dies. The picture's still there, and what's more, if you go there, you who never was there, if you go there and stand in the place where it was, it will happen again. It will be there for you, waiting for you. So Denver, you can never go there. Never. Because even if it's all over and done with, it's going to always be there waiting for you." Not yet. So the past as a place to be feared, experience and the memory of it as a space of danger. After Toni Morrison died, a short essay she had written about Beloved, never published, was retrieved from her archives. In it, she discusses the task she faced to rely on the memory of others, not on history, as a source for her narrative, because history, in her particular case, in the particular case of that novel, was not to be trusted. To rely on her literary tradition, on the other hand, from Melville to Bellow, from Stowe to Flannery O'Connor, would have been reckless, she says. But she had other sources at hand, a heritage of slave narratives. She writes, history versus memory, and memory versus memorylessness. Rememory, as in recollecting, and remembering, as in reassembling the members of the body, the family, the population of the past. And it was the struggle, the pitched battle between remembering and forgetting, that became the device of the narrative. Nobody in the book can bear too long to dwell on the past. Nobody can avoid it. There is no reliable literary or journalistic or scholarly history available to them to help them, because they are living in a society and a system in which the conquerors write the narrative of their lives. They are spoken of and written about, objects of history, not subjects within it. Remembering, as in reassembling the members of the body. I don't know if Toni Morrison was aware of it, but in Latin languages, in Spanish, in Italian, in Portuguese, the verb to remember is recordar, which etymologically means to pass again through the heart. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that beautiful and stunning talk. You know, in the Humanities Institute this year, our theme is travel, and I feel like your talk took us on a journey through history, through some of the masterworks of our literary traditions, and asked us to think about journeys in time and memory, many things. We're going to field questions from our audience, both here and online, but I thought I would start by just asking you, you opened by quoting Paul Valéry, thinking about a time 30 years before his own, and it occurred to me that if we jump back 30 years, that puts us in the early 1990s, which was the moment of the, let's say, premature declaration of the end of history. So I wonder if you could help us understand a little bit more what's involved in reestablishing continuity, and if there are particular moments in world history or events that you know, are moments of rupture that especially challenge the ability to remember or to retrieve across that barrier, in other words, the unevennesses of history, discontinuities, etc.
Yeah. Yes, well, thank you. Well, you know, I was talking this morning to Zach's class, and I was remembering the French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard, who tried to define in the 1970s the moment when we would go from modernity to post-modernity. And he said what defines modernity is the big stories, the big narratives. Everybody in the world has a relationship with these narratives. For instance, Christendom, for instance, Marxism. These all-encompassing stories that seem to structure our lives and our experiences. Doesn't matter where we are in the world, we receive in some sort the influence of these big stories. And he said, the end of modernity will come when these big narratives give way, in a sense, to the small stories, to the petit récit, he said, because he thought that at some point we would begin to understand their lives through smaller stories, stories about our identity, the identity of our little group of individuals that we belong to, stories that are local rather than universal. And he was right. I think this is what we are witnessing now. Identity politics is nothing but that. It's the idea that to belong to a certain group is the most important thing that we have. And that we explain reality and we live in the world through that little space in the world, the space of our identity, of what we feel, the group we feel we belong to. This has been, and this is a very interesting parallel between our times and Paul Valéry in the 30s, this has been helped or ushered in a sense, by technology. In his case, it was all these discoveries that had been made in the previous half a century, but in particular, he was concerned about what he calls in that essay that I quoted. I didn't quote this part, but he was very concerned about the eruption of certain technological advancements in our private lives. And he was talking about radio, how radio had changed the way people behaved as citizens, how the fact that they could hear a speech by Hitler in real time, translated, because translation was funded by the Third Reich, how that helped the rise of fascism. He doesn't explicitly talk about these things, but this was 1935. So if he wasn't thinking about the speeches of Hitler and Mussolini being able to reach you in the privacy of his home, maybe he had it in mind anyway. In a sense, the same rupture in our relationship with our lives as citizens, the same rupture in our social conversations has happened in the last few years because of social media. And the same distortion of our democratic systems, the same distortion of our notion of what it means to be a citizen in free societies has been distorted by the intervention of certain technological things. So I think we are, this can be tiresome and it can be a commonplace to say that we are witnessing things that are similar to Europe in the 1930s. But I do think they're there. And I think they demand our attention, these things, and our concerns as citizens.
Thank you. Are there questions in the audience? Yes?
So I really enjoy your presentation, and I agree a lot. I agree so much that I want just to point out a couple of problems.
Where you don't agree.
So the first one is, let me put it this way, Valéry radio. Walter Benjamin wrote the essay on the work of art, film and radio, and the danger for them was a fascism, the cult of the star or the cult of the leader, the political leader.
Yes.
Today, we have a new technologies, the internet.
Yeah.
And again, for Benjamin, everybody could become a writer, a photographer, and that was one of the implications of the technologies. Now everybody can become a writer and a novelist. So if I follow your reasoning, and the novels are the place of possibilities in which it's possible to write histories with the what if. What is possible today, because everybody has access to these new technologies, everybody can write histories in a certain way, in their own ways. So
Yes.
what we have, or we can have, is a new level of a fragmentation
Yes. Very good.
and a huge proliferation of narratives, histories, and some people call some of these narratives conspiracy theories, but now we have to be, honest enough to call them just different or alternative narratives. So how do we, this is a too big a question, what do we do with this fragmentation? Is this fragmentation our today's danger? Is this fragmentation that can lead to a new form of authoritarianism? Because, second part of my question, what about the force and power? There is the big narratives, the narratives of the official history were also the narratives of the state and the historians who brought the narratives from the state. So it's a huge operation that requires institutions, power, money. It requires a lot of force and organization.
Yeah.
Now we have this level of fragmentation, and we have these fragments of histories and narratives, maybe without a force, or maybe available to someone that has a force enough to put these pieces together. Or, this is maybe the conversation for the dinner, or is there an alternative? Because at a certain point, you showed us an image from Walter Benjamin, and Walter Benjamin would have said, it's not about fragmentation, it's about building different trajectories of a continuity. Yeah. Because the fragmentation, in my opinion, goes in the opposite direction of continuity.
Yes.
Okay, I think that
is enough, yeah.
plenty to talk about here.
Thank
yeah.
you again for your presentation.
Thank you. I love the idea of fragmentation. I think this is one of the symptoms of our current illness as societies, is that fragmentation, not only of the political discourse, but of our understanding as citizens, the way we behave in the social conversation, has a lot to do with the almost personal realities created by the way social media works and the internet works. This has been analyzed by people who know about this much more than I do. One of the pioneers of virtual reality is Jaron Lanier, for instance. Maybe some of you know his writings. And he wrote one beautiful little book that's almost a pamphlet. In 100 pages, he declares war on social media. And what he says is that we should understand what happens in terms of theory of knowledge. Theory of knowledge is imagining what the other is, imagining the stories the other has in her head. Imagining how other people are looking at the world that we are looking at. In a sense, it has to do with empathy, he says. And he says this is what social media is preventing us from doing. Before, we could look at the same world that our neighbor is looking at and try to interpret what he is seeing, how he is or she is seeing the world. And this kind of effort of understanding somebody else is at the root of our sense of citizenship, of collaboration, of solidarity. But because social media is designed, and the internet in a larger sense, but social media in particular, is designed in such a way that through algorithms, you are presented with a version of reality that is different from my version of reality, because you are being fed information and being taken to places that belong only to you because of the information you have given to the algorithms, then the reality you're seeing is different from the reality that I'm seeing. There's the fragmentation that I care about. This is what explains the fact that so many people in the world, that societies are polarized, and in polarized societies, there are two sides. Every side is going to a different movie in the same shopping mall, right? They're attending different movies in different rooms. And there's no possibility of conversation between those people. There's no possibility of consensus or even negotiation, because if you're looking at a version of reality and you are seeing that the other person is saying something completely different, your assumption is that they are lying or they're dishonest, where in reality they are being presented with a version of reality that is slightly different from your own because of the way social media works. So that's deeply worrying, and that I think is something that we should pay attention to. Now, what I think, because I'm kind of a fundamentalist of the novel and of storytelling and fiction, is that maybe fiction can be the place where we repair that fragmentation. Great novels are the place where we, citizens, can reclaim the right to live in the same space and to interpret the world through the same values, could I say? And in any case, when it comes to political conversations, I do feel that, at least in the history of Latin America, novels have been the place where citizens take from power, from the state, the government, from religion, the control of the story. In 100 Years of Solitude by Garcia Marquez, in The War of the End of the World by Mario Vargas Llosa, what happens is that citizens say to that thing we call power, I will get back my right to tell my own story. And this is something that in countries such as mine, literature has always done. Or rather, has recently done for the last 100 years. So maybe in all of that, there's an answer to your questions.
The back there.
First, thanks, that was really quite wonderful, but I experienced a strong tension between the first part of your lecture and the last part of your lecture. In particular, the strong, forceful, inescapable corporeality of rememory. The narration of mind-body together through corporeality. It seems to me in very strong tension with the mentalist, human exceptionalist, philosophical apparatus of Valéry and many others in your talk. Similarly, I experience a strong tension around the notion of what the present is. And I'm drawing from Deborah Bird Rose with her discussion of the Yolnu in Australia, that the serious person faces those who come before so as to leave less blasted country to those who come after. And the present is not a vanishing point, but thick. It is the time of those who can remember the names of the people they're narrating. It's a kind of generational time. It's quite limited, but it's thick and durational and quite different from the notions of temporality that fuel much of what you said. And then the third is technology. The relentlessly, and to me, boring pronouncement that the newest technology, X, chat GPU or whatever, is about to ruin history all the time, everywhere, and especially the future. When I think of, say, what people had to say about the printing press and the possibility of women's literacy, or perhaps the technology that really changed who can tell their own stories, might be contraception. So I not only don't disagree with the notion that imaginative literature is precisely the materiality of grasping the possibility of what might have been but was not but might yet be. I'm completely with you on that. But I feel so many unexamined tensions in the lecture, and I'd be curious how you think about that.
Yeah. Thank you. What was the name of the writer that you mentioned?
The Australian, she's an anthropologist named Deborah Bird Rose.
Okay.
She was taught by elders who taught her a sense of time and story.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I'll take note of that. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, I will have to look for that. Well, thank you. Yes, I do feel obviously that there are tensions in every idea that I have about fiction. I think part of the reason that that I think fiction is important for me as a way of exploring the world is that it is in novels where those tensions can coexist without being resolved. And we can be contradictory, and we can be we can fight with ourselves. Every novel, every genuine novel transmits the idea that we have no definitive conclusions about anything, and that we're constantly struggling to arrive at temporal truths, but not definitive truths. I think part of the way I think about literature has a lot to do with that. But I'm very glad that you liked the second part, because Andrew was mentioning Sebald, Max Sebald, the great German novelist, and one of his novels, Austerlitz. Sebald used to say, he said quite often, that memory is the moral backbone of literature. And I love the idea of the moral backbone because it implies physicality, that we have bodies, not only minds but bodies, and a relationship, a moral relationship with the past is also physical. This is why I love the idea of the verb recordar in Spanish coming from to pass again through the heart. I'm always aware when I talk about how skeptical I am of some modern technologies, and how strongly I feel that really the advent of social media has had a lot to do with the deterioration of our relationships as citizens and of our democracies. But I'm quite aware that this conversation is getting old. I know that. On the other hand, we are just beginning, and it has gotten old quickly, but we're just beginning to realize what AI can mean, artificial intelligence. One of my friends who writes poetry did this experiment just a few days ago. I don't really understand how it works because I haven't been interested in looking it up myself. But you feed some information into the chat, whatever it is, and it can create an essay, a totally original essay. So my friend tried to do the same thing with poetry, with a very particular poetic form that exists in Spanish called the décima. The décima is made of 10 verses, octosyllabic verses, with a certain pattern in the rhyme. And he gave the machine, so to say, all the information, and it came up with the most horrible poem that disrespected the metric, that had no idea of what rhyme was, or that found the silliest rhymes in the world. So if we write poetry, we're safe. Nothing is happening. On the other hand, if we write essays, we might get a little bit worried, or novels, such as I do. But there is a conversation about what will be the future of this thing, language, through which we interpret our existence, our place in the world. It's a question of knowing how to propose the conversation. Thank you.
Sadly,
Andrew.
that brings us to the end of our allotted time. I think Andrew will ask you perhaps later. So please join me in thanking Juan Gabriel for his talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.